Good evening. Good evening. It's your girl Marcy T, and I'm super excited to be with you again for a wonderful episode of the BGC Book Club. So, if this is your first time here, please feel free to drop in the comments that it is your first time, or let us know where you're joining us from, because it's always good to get an idea of everyone who's here. So, this book club has been around since almost actually April makes 3 years, so we'll be celebrating an anniversary then. And in that time, I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of wonderful Black women writers, ranging from poetry to nonfiction, memoir, fiction, all of the above. So I'm super excited to have just another debut author with us this evening, because we love to be able to not only share those who have experience or have been around for a while, but also to introduce you to new voices. So tonight I am fortunately blessed to have with us Tracey Rose Peyton, and we'll be talking about her book, Night Wherever We Go. And Tracey Rose Peyton received her MFA from the Missioner Center for Writers at the University of Texas, Austin, and her BA from the number one HU, and that's Howard University. Sorry if you went to Hampton. But she went to Howard University. She's an alum of the Vona Voices Callaloo, the Writers Institute at CUNY, Sackett Street, and Tin House, and has received fellowships from Hedgebrook and Salenstall Foundation for the Arts. Her short fiction has appeared in Guernica, American Short Fiction, Prairie Schooner, Best American Short Stories 2021, and elsewhere. And she currently lives in Los Angeles. So without any further delay, let's welcome Tracey Rose Peyton to the space. Welcome, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yes. I could see you smiling in the background when I mentioned HU. So
HU?
you know.
You know?
Oh, welcome, Cheryl. Actually, you say you're from Southfield, Michigan. I actually lived in Southfield, Michigan for several years. So it's exciting to have a Southfield person here. So Tracey, congratulations, first of all, on your new book. It's pretty exciting. Been out for about a month or so now.
Came out January 3rd. So,
all right.
Yes, I'm still
almost
getting
2 months.
Almost 2 months now, yeah.
Wow, that's exciting. So how does it feel for you being a first-time author and just going through this whole process of getting your work out into the world and being able to share with readers about your work?
It's great. I feel like it's also a little scary. Like, I think, when you're working on something for so long and you hold it very close to you, and then now it's like out in the world without you.
Right.
And then I think also, like, you spend so much time with these characters that, like, once the book is over, like, I feel like I was kind of depressed for a while because I was with the women every day. But I'm so happy and excited for other people to meet them and to people spend time with them, and hopefully they will love them as much as I do.
Yes, and the characters are definitely ones that will stick with you. Just the story in general, we were talking about that, before we came on, how I actually read the book and had a chance to like sit with the characters and understand who they are, understand the story, to see all the ebbs and flows, and it's just really a good book. So for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, kind of give us a synopsis of what the story is.
Sure. Night Wherever We Go is about a group of enslaved African-American women brought to the Texas frontier by a struggling farmer and his wife in the 1850s. When the land doesn't yield as expected, the plantation owners turn their attention to the women's fertility. And they decide to turn around the farmers' bleak financial prospects by forcing the women to bear children. The couple hires a stockman, or basically like a breeding man, to impregnate them. And in response, the women wage a covert rebellion by using herbal abortives to control the birth rate and maintain some degree of autonomy over their lives and their bodies. It's a story about resistance, but it's also really about sisterhood and the interior lives of enslaved women.
Right. And that's what really made it so powerful for me, because, there have been a lot of stories that talk about, people being enslaved women, but not from this perspective. And I really love the fact that this is a group of women who were really empowered to take control, as much control as they could potentially take over their own lives in this situation. So what was it that kind of prompted you to even want to go this route, in your storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's always hard to kind of pinpoint like one seed of a story, but I would say probably the two biggest points of, I would say points of origin are probably Dorothy Roberts' Killing the Black Body, where I don't know if anyone's never read it. I would suggest like go read it. I feel like it's one of the most important books I've ever read. And in it, she's really talking about reproductive health and reproductive rights for Black women, and how you can chart from enslaved women and kind of everything that's happening with quote unquote breeding, all the way up to eugenics, to forced sterilization in the 50s and 60s, like in Dolan Perkins, amazing new book.
Right.
Down to 1890s, what was happening with Norplant and Deborah Rivera. And then, the book ends I think she wrote it in the late 90s, I think is when it came out. But I feel like if you're thinking about maternal mortality rates and like all the things we're talking about, Black health and like Black women having, higher rates of fibroids and higher rates of hysterectomies, like I feel like you can chart a through line through our entire history through her book. So I feel like I would say that's one point of origin. I think the other point of origin was I was reading Paula Giddings' When and Where I Enter, which is an amazing political history about Black women. And she had one chapter where she talked about resistance by enslaved women. And one of the things she talked about was, I think what historians now talk about the term, gynecological resistance. Mm-hmm. And in it, she talks about this one instance on a plantation in Tennessee where these 4 to 6 women for like 20 years controlled the birth rate on their farm. Mm. So every few years, the owner would, swap out the women, because it was like, he was trying to figure out why nothing was happening. And it turned out that there was an old woman who was giving them a remedy. And so I think I read that like a long time ago, and I just like couldn't stop thinking about it. Like, how did these women do that? And what kind of discussions were they having among themselves? To adhere to that, like what did they give up to do that? I just had so many questions when I read that, and I just want to know more about them. And in the archive, of course, is often rife with silences. There's just so much that we just can't know. On base of, there's just so much that's hard to. There's just so much that's missing, I think, when you read a story.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And, as you were saying that, and you mentioned is Killing the Black Body. So everybody jot that down.
Dorothy Roberts.
A good resource. And other Dolan Perkins Valdez's Take My Hand is the name of that book. That was actually one of my favorite books from last year because of the storytelling. But now I can add yours to one of my because I love seeing a story where there are women that are resisting, because a lot of times we are playing it in solely a victim role, but this is the opposite of that. I mean, there were times when they were victimized, but I did not consider them to be victims.
Oh, for sure.
There is a difference. Things can happen to you, but those things don't have to define you. So one of the things, I mentioned this to you earlier, I found it interesting that they are on this plantation, this small plantation, and they are owned by a family called the Harlows, but they have another name for them.
Yes, they're referred to often as the Lucys. Short.
Right. Lucifer, the devils. So I thought that was interesting. But the wife actually hailed from Liberty County, Georgia, which is where my mother is from. So I found that interesting as well. So I do know that you have a tie to Georgia from your own family roots. So what was it that made you decide to center your story in Texas versus Georgia?
Mm-hmm. Initially, I would say it was in Georgia. Again, just because my family's from there, and like that's the place where we would go every summer, and like, my grandfather had land, and the red dirt roads, and it's very evocative, especially if you're coming from coming from Chicago. So initially it was set in Georgia in my like first or second draft. And then I went to grad school in Texas, and I got super inspired by Texas. One, I just felt like we often don't think of Texas as connected to slavery, when it was a big part of slavery, and it was a big part of the, I guess I would say the expansion of the empire at that point.
Right.
And so I got really interested in that, and I got really interested in Texas as a place. Like, it's one of the few places I think that still has a very strong regional identity. They still really that 7 years of independence during the Republic of Texas still lives very large for them. It's like, when you're there, it's like everywhere. It's like so I don't know. I think the more I was there, I just kept digging, and as I started digging and doing more research, there was a connection between what someone might call "quote unquote" slave breeding and Texas. Like, it just kept coming up in the narratives over and over and over again, and I was like, okay, there's a real connection here, and it makes sense, I think, based on what was happening in the country at that time. I will try not to ramble too much about the historical context, but
right.
Yeah, but it's like, it's on the, I guess the short answer would be to think of it as, when the transatlantic slave trade closes in 1808, and then you have like this large the movement of industrialization that's moving enslaved people from the upper South to the lower South. And then you have the expansion into like, Mississippi and into the West. And at that point, then the prices of enslaved people become very, very high. So at that point, the focus on reproduction becomes higher and higher and higher.
Right, which does make sense, but just in terms of, I think a lot more people have become aware of Texas when you think of Juneteenth, because they were the last ones to, what led up to that, them being the last ones to actually find out that they were free. But I found it very interesting in the story because just the mere fact of the breeding of women with men, and the fact that, the owner's take was, well, we can get these women and we can work them and we can breed them.
Yep.
So, talk a little bit about that.
I feel like that was, it's horrible to say, but for slaveholders, that was kind of common knowledge, I think, at a point where I think you'll see in the letters between them where they'll say, hey, like, one, if your fortune is dwindling or whatever, and you're worried, of course, invest in slaves, quote unquote, right? And then beyond that, I feel like I need to have it on hand, but there is a percentage that Thomas Jefferson even does the math where he's like, oh, by the natural increase of my enslaved workforce, them marrying and having children, I make X percentage per year, right? So add to that, I think, what I call the unnatural increase, which is when you try to force reproduction in these unnatural and awful ways. Then that's when you get this other kind of component to it. So it's the history is wild. It is.
It is to think that, and even though this takes place in the 1800s, there was a piece of me from a contemporary point of view. I'm like, well, isn't that kind of like now they want us to have the babies and do all the work? So, a different time, but there are things that are, that I could even see in contemporary times, the expectation of Black women to kind of do it all, and take care of everything. So that stood out. One of the other things is the fact that, they pull these women from different places. It's 6 main women that are talked about in the story, and they all have a different story. They all come from different places, and they're brought to this plantation in Texas. But they, like I said, they all come with a different story. So what was it that made you want to tell so many different stories within the context of the larger story?
I think specifically that I think I wanted to show diversity within the enslaved community, right? I think people are often spoken of as if they're a monolith, and I just want to make sure that like I added that complexity back into the mix. That if you're, depending on where you were coming from, depending on what experience of quote unquote cash crop that you worked on, your experience of the institution was different. And I just felt like that was important to focus on, and that was important to bring kind of back into, I think, the kind of dialogue that we've been having about our ancestors.
Right, because they do, as I said, they all come from different places. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the different women that are featured in that part of the story. I'm going to start with the oldest, who was Nan. So tell us a little bit about Nan.
Nan is a midwife, and she's kind of a healing woman, or what I guess they used to call sometimes a doctoring woman. And so she has a special relationship with plants, and so she can make remedies and medicines, but she's also the cook on the farm. And so she kind of has a different relationship to kind of what's happening than the rest of the women, just because she's not of childbearing age anymore. But that means she tries to use her knowledge in other ways to try to help the women thwart kind of what's happening. And I think, to me, she's such an important character in terms of like thinking about midwives and the power of doulas. And I think we're kind of seeing that now, where I think more and more people are kind of gravitating toward doulas and midwives. And I think when you read kind of the history of childbirth in America, it's really interesting to watch how, especially granny, quote unquote, granny midwives or African-American midwives, right, how they were pushed out of the medical field. And I think they're sorely needed. I think we see kind of what happens when we lose that connection, when we lose having a birth worker, in your community, in your neighborhood, that knows you, that has a relationship with their family, that has a relationship with families around you. I'll stop there.
Right, because, well, for anybody, it's your first time. We don't do spoilers. It's just enough to kind of give you an idea of who the characters are. Mm-hmm. What I liked about Nan is the fact that, she did come with so much wisdom. And it just really makes me think about, even if you hear stories of the women who may have come over directly from Africa, how they braided, seeds in their hair and, all these different things that we brought things with us. And there were certain skills that we had in terms of understanding the land, understanding the plants, knowing, one from another, what's going to be good for, a stomach ache versus, what's going to help you if you stub your toe. I mean, whatever. They could figure all these things out. They came with that knowledge. And it's something I am glad to see that we're starting to get back to that people are seeking out that information. As not too long ago, I was in South Carolina on the coast, and somebody was talking about putting the moss in your shoe that helps. Yeah. And I was like, what? I never heard that. So it's just, there's certain things that others might look at as being, that's kind of witchy poo. But I'm like, well, not really.
Yeah. I think I feel, those traditions are so important. I feel like even I think about how in my family, I feel like what's great about the book is that I've had more conversations with my family about some of these traditions, because I feel like, because I was raised in the Midwest, I was raised in Chicago, we didn't talk about that stuff a lot.
Right.
Or whatever. So my mom's like, what you know about that? I'm like, well, why did you tell me about that? Right. But I think the thing I was kind of interested in the book around some of the healing traditions, but also connection with conjure and practical magic, and how that's not, I think for Black folks, or at least it wasn't separate from Christianity, right?
Right.
You know what I mean? People had a very healthy respect for both things, and some people practiced both and some people didn't, but I feel like they were both kind of part of the lexicon. I think in this way that I feel like a lot of times we kind of think of them as separate.
Right. And I think that's some of the things that even in modern times, some people may, feel a way about it because they think that the two things are separate, but not really. Mm-hmm. Not really. And I love the way that you were able to bring that into the story. But speaking of which, Patience is another character, and she has a Louisiana has roots in Louisiana. So of course she's coming to things with a different perspective.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was interested in exploring this diversity of religion. So Patience is the Catholic among them. And all the women are not Christian. Some of them, are not, maybe some of them are holding on to the African ways or spirit ways. And she's kind of the Catholic among them who is still trying to kind of figure out her relationship to things, because she's, off kilter by being kind of rooted, uprooted from Louisiana, uprooted from her husband. And with her, I think we also see kind of the complications of having a child, right? A child that works in the house that you don't get to mother in the way that you want to mother. And how that's kind of heartbreaking, and it creates tension between not just you and your kid, but you and your spouse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And really, yeah, I'm sorry, a little tongue tied for a second. The story definitely brings up the whole thing of mothering. And I think of the story that is told in Beloved, how mothers have to make choices, with children. What are you going to do with your children? Are you going to have the child? How are you going to raise the child? The fear of what can happen to the children that you may have in these types of situations. So this, lightly touches on those sorts of things as well. The choices that women have to make as mothers, which, Margaret Garner was the lady's name.
Yeah.
She had to make that choice as well. So.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah. So I think I was interested in definitely exploring different variations of some of that, right? Like what it is to mother, what it means to like make the choice to not have children, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, that's a sacrifice that some women made, in service of resistance, where you will see in the narratives women who felt like that they weren't going to have babies till emancipation, and I don't want to romanticize that, because that meant also a very hard life. If you were considered barren, you were sold more often,
right.
So I mean, people, again, the question about like, what kind of choices did you make, or you feel like were available to you, each of them had consequences, and they were often horrible choices all around, no matter what direction you chose to step in.
Right. Because make it clear, we're not glorifying what these women went through, but just the fact that they had to, they came up with an idea that will allow them to resist. That's the main thing. And, speaking of, being sold off, we have one character that does happen to early in the story. So we really don't know what happens with her, going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I wanted to also just explore that tension of the group, right? What it means to make friends or make allies. You're strangers, you come together as strangers, you're treated as a unit, which means you don't always like each other. Right. Sometimes there are tensions in between the group. But also, with a character like that, it's like, I think both Alice and Lulu had experienced both some of that. And like, I think with them, you see the trust issues that creates, what kind of defense mechanisms that creates, and how that kind of sometimes can create tensions with the women themselves. And also like what it means to like make friendship and create sisterhood and create kinship with folks, and then just have them disappear, right? And how that's not just about your spouse, right? I think like, what is it, the Frederick Douglass quote where, he talked about how much he missed his friends, his male friends, like that was part of the heartbreak for him, where it was like, not, that, so it's just, that the breaking of all these different type of kinship ties are traumatic.
Right, because oftentimes, in these types of narratives, we hear about, the husbands and wives, even though in many cases they really weren't, legally married, or the selling of children and things like that. But, to really think about what happens if you're one of your friends is no longer there, because it's not like you can write them, or anything like that. You don't have the kind of access that, people would have in today's society. So that is something to think, that someone just disappears and you never really know what becomes of them, because of that. But it also speaks to just the whole process of what these women were going through. We know about, how women are poked and prodded and things like that when they're being sold. We knew that was the case. But then also, even in this case, when the whole point is for them to get pregnant, and it doesn't happen because they have done something to keep it from happening, how people are poking and prodding on them as well, and trying to figure out what's going on with them, and why is it that you're not having these babies. So it makes me think about some of the things with early gynecology and how this ties to that.
For sure. I think that's also super interesting too, which is that, the anecdote that kind of was one of the seeds of the novel comes from a medical journal, right? And it comes from a medical journal because doctors and slaveholders were kind of, working very closely together. Doctors, I mean, of course, at this time, the field of medical medical practice is new, right? So doctors are looking for clientele, and one way to have clientele is to move to the South and make slaveholders and their enslaved workforce your clientele. And so for that reason, they were often very of service to slaveholders and what slaveholders' desires and wants were. And so it's really interesting to see how those two things worked in concert. And then I feel like and then I feel like the later evolution of that is I feel like the pushing out of, of African-American midwives from the business.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Lulu, tell us a little bit about Lulu. She is one of the other characters.
Yeah, Lulu is she's one of the women who she's been sold 4 or 5 times by the time she comes to Texas, and and so she has a very different way of looking at things than some of the other women. And she's one of my favorite characters because she's I feel like a character who she just kind of has no filter.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And she's the kind of person that will just kind of say whatever to you, and not necessarily to offend you, but just because
Right,
you felt like saying that to you
right.
today.
We all know somebody like that.
Exactly, exactly. And I think, yeah, and I think that's the thing too. I wanted to see in the book, which was, I think all the colors that we know in terms of how we know Black folks operate in terms of their wit, the razor blade tongue. We all know Black women that could cut you with their tongue. You know what I
Right.
mean, right? Um, and so I just felt like I wanted to see that color in the enslaved community, where I feel like I don't actually see that color. I feel like a lot of times I feel like they're spoken about as if they're robots, right? As if because of the narrative, just because of the nature of the oppression, that they didn't have emotion or could never share emotion. And I'm like, I don't really think that. Like, we have that wit because they had that wit, right? We
Right.
have that. Uh, that way of turning a phrase. I mean, I think we see with Jordan and Hurston, right? That way of turning a phrase, or that particular kind of sense of metaphor. That's not, we didn't create that. That came from
Right.
them. All right. And so just kind of wanting to like bring some of those colors like back into the dialogue, where it's just like, so see a woman like Lulu who will just, she'll just cut you with her tongue just because she felt like it on Tuesday.
Exactly.
and go about her business.
Exactly. And one thing I have to say, were also some spaces for joy. Like I'm thinking early in the book when when everyone is all together, how they kind of come together and they're dancing and moving and things like that. So to know that we then and we now, we could always find moments and spaces of joy, spiritual connection, social connection, and all of those sorts of things. So it was good to see that as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's a historian, the late Stephanie Camp, who I feel like I owe a great debt to, and she wrote a lot about the quote unquote frolics, right? Like the parties that enslaved people would have on like Friday and Saturday nights, and like and that space where women would get dressed up and they would dye a dress. They would like starch a dress and dye it and make a hoop skirt and like dye the shoes to match the dress, whatever. And go to the party and dance till the patrollers came and then you got to run home, like. But that space of like joy and instrumentation and like dance contest and like I think those are really rich spaces, and I just wanted to explore those spaces too. I wanted I feel like those were important to see.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. They definitely were. Now I say these last two because these last two have like really strong parts in the story that I really want to get into. I'm gonna start with Junie. Now I really loved Junie in the book. She was something else. She was something else. Just the way that she, moved about the world and some of the things that she was able to do. And sometimes she was saying what she really felt as well. So I love that about her. So tell us a little bit about Junie's character.
Yeah, I think Junie was a character who she started out in Georgia with the Harlows, or with the Lucys, as I call them. um, and so she's been with that white family the longest. So she understands things about them that the rest of the women don't necessarily understand or know. Um, and so for that reason, she's had a relationship with Lizzie's family, Lizzie, the mistress of the plantation. So she's had a relationship with her for a long time. They grew up together. Um, Judy's family was owned by Lizzie's family. And as such, her kids are now in the custody of Lizzie's brother. And for that reason, though Lizzie likes to think of them because they grew up together as if they are friends. And they call her up to the house when she gets upset and she's lonely and she wants to, talk like like they're old friends just having tea. And, but Junie has to kind of play the role because she wants news of her children back home. And the only way she can kind of get it is to kind of placate this relationship and placate Lizzie's feelings. And so I thought that tension was kind of interesting to explore.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we have this comment. Henry Louis Gates talks about life beyond behind the veil, how Black people had to create a space of life beyond what the white folks saw. Absolutely, absolutely.
Absolutely.
They're on the weekends when they could, and sometimes other times they're just finding a space to, their own place where they would go into, and like you said, until they couldn't party any longer.
Or we'll pray in the woods in the hush harbor, or just anytime that they were away from surveillance, they had, a little moment, to themselves to think and to be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is something. Well, I'm gonna say it because it's on my mind. Sometimes we still need that place where we can just go and be free and just sing our songs and dance our dances and drink our drink, as they say, and just enjoy ourselves and be away from the view of others. Not having to be under a microscope where we're being watched or judged or things like that. That freedom is powerful even now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before I get into the last character that I want to talk about, I do want to ask you a question about the title. Night Wherever We Go. So what was it that made you choose that title for the book, or did the title choose you?
I feel like the title, excuse me, I feel like the title came late. I think I had a working title that I was kind of attached to for a while. And this one, I would say, I think it's like, I feel like it's one of these titles where I feel like it's completely always revealing itself to me. Like I feel like I have an idea what I think it means or what I think it means for the story. And I feel like next year, if someone asks me, I'm gonna have a completely different answer. But I mean, I feel like the night is so rich in the book. Like the night is, the time when, they're away from surveillance. The night is when they, gather together amongst themselves. The night is when they gather and they go frolic. But the night is also, it's a space of freedom, but it's also a space where horrible things happen, right? That's also around the time when they are often put with the stockman, and and that's in the evenings after work. And so the night holds all these things. And on one hand, it's like, and so it holds the good, it holds the bad, and it's with you no matter where you go, no matter wherever at the place. That is next. It's like, what is that Buddhist quote? Like wherever you go, there you are.
Well, yes.
Yeah, right. Like they're, the things that you can't kind of escape, they're always kind of with you, both for good and for bad.
Right, as I was telling you earlier, a fan or a friend of BGC Book Club, Tina McElroy Ansel, was saying she loved your title. So that's why I wanted to bring that up. So
yeah, she's amazing.
Yes,
that's high praise. That's high praise from her.
yes. She and I'm going to try to get her on here to talk about one of her classic stories. So I'll work on that. So, but yes, I really like the way that you say that because there's night and then there's day, and a lot of times we think of day as this bright, this light, there's all these wonderful things happen in the light of day, but versus the things that happen at night. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, Sarah, she is the youngest character. Mm-hmm. And I also found her just to be, equally, all of the women are powerful, but I think for me, my two favorites were Junie and Sarah. So talk a little bit about Sarah. She's the baby of the family, so to speak.
Yeah, she's the baby of the group. And I feel like it was important to have someone like her who didn't quite understand all the quote unquote workings of the institution, right? Like, so there are things that the older women understand about life that she doesn't quite understand. And she's a little bit naive in some ways and hopeful in ways that the other women are no longer hopeful. And so, yeah, I wanted to explore that tension. And I feel like she's also the person for that reason. It's like we get to see love through her eyes, right? What does it mean to like fall in love? What does it mean to like want a partner and have a family with someone and not be able to? And then like, what are you willing to do to keep this, bit of sweetness in your life that you found? And so, yeah, so I feel like I love her for that reason, that I feel like she's the person who like she's the most pure in that way, where it's like she has a desire and she wants to try to make it happen, even if it doesn't make any sense.
Right. And she's also very powerful, though. I think that a lot of that is that youth.
Yeah.
in because where older people may be a little bit more like, oh, I've been through this before, I've experienced that before, I don't want to take a chance, I don't want to take a risk, maybe I might play it a little more safely. That is not Sarah. And that's really what I loved about her character, is that she was going to fight for what she believed in a multitude of ways that you'll have to read the story to find out. But she fought for what she wanted. She fought for what she believed in. And, she just wasn't, taking a whole lot of crap either. As a young person, as a young character, willing to take a lot of risks. And I really do like the fact that we did get a chance to see love in the story, because that is something, that is important for us to know that. I mean, I guess we know that, but just to actually read a story to see that, okay, there were Black people who loved each other in these less than ideal situations, and they took a lot of chances, and they took risks and things like that to be able to have those relationships. And even though they may have found themselves doing something else later on, they still maintain that love for that person. But just to see that, because we oftentimes get a lot of negative press about, and there is some truth to it, but how slavery impacted Black relationships even to this day. Mm-hmm. So it was just good to see that. So was that a consideration while you were writing the story, or?
Oh, for sure. I feel like you can't read those narratives without seeing without seeing or being inspired. At least I would say, inspired by the lengths people went to stay together, to stay with their, wives or see their children, men who walked 5 miles every week, mm-hmm. and I feel like in contemporary times, we're like, oh, I can't get somebody to walk 8 miles. Right. Copy that. But let alone walk 5 miles every week, right, or 2 miles or whatever, or however, or men who, if their women, if their wives were sold off, would walk 2 states to try to, and they were in a situation where they were free and their wife was enslaved, would walk 2 states or travel however many months to try to find her. And so I feel like there's no way I feel like I could read those stories and just not be inspired by the lengths people were willing to go to stay together, to be with one another, to see each other, to try and forge relationships. And I think I was saying to someone the other day that, like, it's like there's that piece of it before emancipation, and then the piece after that. I'm so inspired by this too, where like the amount of people who, like, as soon as emancipation came, if you were with someone who wasn't the person you really wanted to be with, people were like, all right, I'm out. I'm gonna go find I gotta go find my love, because you were the person I wanted to be with. I got forced in this particular situation. And when you read, and so those are just amazing. I feel like so it's just, there's so much there about partnership and kinship, and that I just think is inspiring to us, or at least inspiring to me. I can't speak for no one else.
Right. But I'm going to talk about another character that is important to the story. It's primarily centered on the 6 women, but this is one of the men in the story, and that's Zeke.
Oh, yes, Zeke.
Mm-hmm. Zeke was the breeder, or what's the other name that you had for him?
Stockman.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about him, because, I mean, you did a good job of kind of sharing his perspective of what was going on with him.
Yeah, I thought that was important. I think, I think there are a lot of historians now who are doing a lot more work around the sexual abuse of men under slavery, right? Looking at sexual abuse of men, looking at sexual abuse of children, and really kind of widening the frame in terms of how we typically thought about kind of all the kind of horrible things that were happening. So Zeke is a man who, who's basically brought to impregnate the women. And he's often, I think sometimes they called him a traveling man, right? Mm-hmm. So he's to other farms to do this. And he has a wife and children, back on his home farm. And, this is the price of trying to keep his family together. And whenever he kind of resists kind of doing this, his master threatens to sell his children. And so to me, it's holding that line that I think Toni Morrison says, that you could get people to do anything if you threaten their family, you threaten their children. Yeah. And so I feel like it was important to it was important to kind of dive to me into that perspective, because I think sometimes if you see it, if you read the WPA narratives or whatever, and you'll see stories of men who were sent on these, sent to do this type of work, you'll get this kind of bravado, right? They'll describe it as in like, oh, I used to, I gave so many women babies and I loved it. It was amazing. And they're kind of bragging, right? But I'm like, I don't believe that, right? I think that's what you say if someone sticks a mic in your face and asks you about a horrible thing, right? Versus what that experience must have been like, right? Where it's like, yeah, just the horror that you're being asked to rape somebody. Yeah. So I just thought it was important to like give him like a full perspective.
Right. And I could appreciate that, because otherwise you would just read it and be like, oh, this is so terrible. He's a bad person. But to realize he's doing what he has to do for the sake of his survival and the survival of his family. And, these were the types of situations that people were placed in, during that time. So, it humanized him to, to see that story and to understand why, he was doing the different things that he was doing. Oh, Cheryl saying she never heard of the term stockman. I hadn't either. So that brings up another thing I was going to ask you about. There's so much history in the telling of your story. What was your research process like to find, because you had to learn about Texas, you had to learn about enslavement, you had to learn about, stockmen and all these other types of things. So how long did it actually take you to go through the research process?
I would say I've been probably working on this book for about 10 years.
Wow.
And I'll say that like at each point, I think at each point, I feel like every time I thought I had like understood something, I would read more and be like, okay, you don't understand what you think you understand. You know what I mean?
Right.
Where I feel like the text will just kind of open up and open up and open up. Like the more I read around certain things, I would go back to things I already read and see something I had never seen before. So I feel like it was one of these things where it's like, this is the kind of book to me you can research forever. There's still things I feel like, I was talking to a friend the other day about, food, and she was talking about, particular things that enslaved people ate. And I think I focused a lot on corn, but she was talking about biscuits and other things. And I was like, there's a whole other thing I could have added about this or that. So yeah, it's just one of these things where it's like, you could research this forever if you're, I think if you're curious and you don't come to it as if you understand it completely, or as if you know it in terms of based on, I think a lot of times I think we think about this subject in a way where it's like, oh, okay, I know this already. And I feel like at each time, I feel like the research would just open up another thing where it's like, didn't know that. Here's another thing. Here's another piece to explore. Here's another something. Here's just another nugget to share.
Yeah, because I'm thinking, well, I think earlier on, well, you went to school in Texas, so that was your opportunity to be in Texas. So did you visit like any of the plantations or any of the spaces just to kind of get a feel, for describing what the actual land and things like that look like?
I didn't in Texas because unfortunately I lived in New York for a long time, which means I don't drive very well.
Oh, okay.
And so I think, so there were a couple of places where I think when I was in Georgia, I think I've been to Savannah and been to the different spaces in Savannah. I think in New York, I went to some places upstate. When I was in Texas, I did more of the, just because I was connected to a university, I just had access to so much more research.
Okay.
So there are a number of architectural studies that people have done. Like I can nerd out and give people books if they're interested, but there are particular architectural studies people have done of like looking at plantations. I think Michael Black's book is one of the best. I think it's Behind the Big House, where he'll kind of break down like each kind of the porch, the house, the smokehouse, all the different outbuildings, and talk about how they worked and how they were in relationship to. But Texas also has these architectural studies where like you could pull up a thing about a particular farm and it would have the diagram of the farm.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. So you could see that and how it was laid out. So I would look at a lot of things like that. I would look at a lot of maps and weird diagrams and like just other things in terms of just trying to think about the geography. Right. So I feel like there were a lot of like books about Texas.
Okay.
About Texas topography, because Texas, which is interesting because I think my assumption before I moved there was that, Texas is just, I think that what we picture from the Westerns, right? It's just desert, but it's not. It's like, it's all these things. It's like swamp, it's savanna. It has like 4 different types of typographies all kind of connected in this land. And so it's plains, it's all these things. So yeah, just trying to kind of dig into that and make that more rich.
And that just made me think of something else in the story, the fact that, you know, when the Lucys, you know, took them there, they went there thinking they'd be able to do one thing with the land and found out that that really wasn't going to work necessarily. And then, you know, you have to pivot. So I think that that's something because it's so different. You know, you think, oh, it's, you know, it's Texas, it's Southern, it's hot. But that doesn't mean anything if the land is different, if the environment is different.
Oh, for sure. I think those stories are super interesting too, where it's like, I think there's a series of letters that I was kind of drawn to, and it was letters from a Texas farmer, and most of the letters, you know, he's writing back to his family back in, I think maybe North Carolina or somewhere, and in it you see that, and you see to me that trajectory where it's like in the beginning it's like, oh, it's amazing, like things just grow here so easily, the buffalo are just full, they're just calves walking around, right, everything, you know, it like basically talks about it like it's Eden. And then as the years get harder and there's frost and there's nothing but rain and everything dies on the vine, and then there's, you know, locusts, like there's just thing after thing after thing, and it's like you start to understand like that quote unquote frontier thing that I think Americans romanticize was really, really hard, and that if the weather didn't cooperate, if the land didn't cooperate, it was just a disaster.
And we see that play out in the story, as well as these brilliant women deciding that they're not going to give them more slaves. Which I love it. And it, you know, it takes a while for some things to happen, which you have to read the story to find out what those things are. But the last character I do want to bring up, because I have to, and that is Lizzie.
I thought you were going to say Noah. See, I was wrong.
No, Lizzie. I mean, Noah was important. Well, I'll back up and then we'll come back to her. Noah, I like Noah as well. He is the love interest of Sarah. So just talk a little bit about his journey and what he winds up doing.
Yeah, I mean, Noah is, Sarah's love interest is the young man she falls in love with and who she tries to take particular types of risks to be with. And without getting into spoiler, but we see kind of Noah kind of run away and head toward Mexico. And I just thought it was interesting to talk about that particular journey of people who were, you know, enslaved in Texas or enslaved in Oklahoma, that they often ran to Mexico as a space to be free. And there was even, you know, a town of enslaved African Americans there. And there's just a super rich history of that that I thought was kind of worth exploring. And I feel like that's a whole nother book that I feel like I'm not qualified to write, but I want someone to write about those settlements in Mexico, or those settlements on the border between Texas and Mexico. I feel like there's a whole thing there.
Yes, absolutely. That would be, because we don't think about that. Because, you know, because a lot of the narratives that we get are talking about fleeing to go, you know, the Underground Railroad to go north. Yeah. You don't think about people actually going into Mexico. And see, now you've got me wondering, it's like, I wonder how many like Black people or people of African descent that are actually in Mexico. I wonder about that.
Yeah.
You ran across in your
I feel like I think someone did ask me that recently, and I feel like I need to find the statistic for next time I'm asked this question, because I do remember someone I knew years ago who was working on a documentary where she had found this community of folks who were basically the descendants of those communities, and she had like found them. She was doing a documentary on kind of what their lives were like in the current moment. But I think it is something I should look into and try to figure out what the statistics are currently, like, you know, how many of those communities survived, and how many people stayed, because I know there's some, like, you can see it in some of the Texas narratives about this one man in particular, I think, who, you know, went to Mexico and he just kind of waited out the war. And so then he went back to Texas, and that's kind of where he settled with his family. So the question of like how many people kind of migrated there and stayed, or versus how many people, you know, like built a life there, and raised children there, and, you know, so forth. Yeah,
that's interesting. So I guess that's something for us all to figure out. To look that up. So that's your homework assignment. Try to find out. But, you know, what about Africans in Mexico? Because it's just not something you really think about that much.
Mhm.
So that's something, because I mean, I know that Lupita Nyong'o, I'm gonna say it wrong. Lupita
Yeah.
lived there, but her father was like a diplomat or something like that. So she lived there for a long time, but she's not a native of Mexico. So that I do know, but it just would be interesting to find that out. So yes, so I do want to go back to Lizzie though, because
Yeah.
she had a pretty significant role in the story as well.
Mhm.
Even though she was not one of the initial six, she's not a sister.
Mhm.
But
And
she had a significant part in the story. Just tell us a little bit about Lizzie.
yeah, Lizzie is I guess, what people often think of as a quote unquote mistress or plantation mistress, sort of. But you know, but I think I shouldn't even say that, because I feel like I don't want people to have that in their minds. Like she's not Scarlett O'Hara.
No, she's not.
She is a disgruntled, upset woman who's married to a man who can't rub two nickels together. That's how she would say it. And she's in this situation where she's been brought to Texas, and she's someone called her a bad mother. I wouldn't necessarily call her a bad mother. She's not a great mom. But she's in a situation where she's like living in Texas. She's isolated from her family. She has followed her husband to quote unquote create this dream of it, of the fortune, and is having, bearing children, back to back, and having difficulties bearing children. And so for her, she hopes that the women having children will help her. Like they will, she'll have a wet nurse, she'll have these things that will make her life easier. And so their resistance impacts her directly.
Right.
In a way that creates friction between her and them, and her and her husband.
And I brought her up because it lets you see, just from a historical point of view, that women didn't have, white women didn't have any kind of agency either. Not really. Not at that time of life. There were choices and decisions that they had to make that weren't necessarily in their best interest as well. So even though we're concerned more about the six key Black women, but I just had to bring that point up because we do have a diverse audience that watches the show. So just to let you know that is something that's talked about in the story as well. And I think even the way that she's presented, people probably won't like her.
Oh, for sure.
But it also humanizes her, and I think that that's good when authors such as yourself take characters that may be a little controversial or unlikable for obvious reasons, but then you find ways to kind of humanize them, so you still might not like what they do, but at least you can get an understanding as to why.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like I didn't want to make her or even her husband a cartoon. I feel like the book is not. I feel like the book is made better by them being human, even if we don't like them. And I think that's part of the interesting thing about slavery, that people who were understanding that these were people who were human and had, I don't know, like had love for their children, or had desires to be X, Y, or Z, that still for some reason participated in this moral failing, right? And so I think I was talking to someone the other day, and I think he couldn't wrap his head around how could people do that to one another? And it's like, clearly, the history of,
Right.
not just America, of the world is people doing horrible things to one another.
Right.
And so, so I feel like it was important to humanize them in that way, just to understand that, again, it's not that they were monsters. They aren't monsters, but they're monsters who we understand as human.
Right. And that's true. I mean, let's face it. I mean, even though it's historical, there are parallels. You look at some of the things that are happening even in our modern times, where you're like, ooh, like, what's going on? How can people do this to each other? How can people not understand? Why was it 2020 before people realized that there was racism? And like, do you all not know history? Right. All of these different things.
Totally. So I think that, I feel like those stories make sense, I think, when we understand them through a human lens, right? When we understand, so it's just, I think it just made it part of trying to understand the time period is trying to understand the psychology of how someone thinks they can own another person.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And even though I still don't claim to understand it,
Right.
but trying to, we're reading the stories or reading the journals of especially like quote unquote mistresses like Lizzie, it's so wild just to see how they thought about things.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, actually, our time is almost up, but I have another question to ask you. Just in the process of writing such a powerful story, and bringing in all these different elements and the different women and things like that, how did it impact you, in writing the story? I mean, how did it make you feel in writing the story?
I mean, I'll say like I'm not gonna pretend that like it wasn't hard that that there's some days that you don't like. I would say like when I would go back into the research and I would just read something so horrible that I'm just like, okay, that's it for the day.
Right.
The work is done. But I would say, writing a book is a marathon, and I think the thing that kept me going was that I felt like their stories were important, and the stories of our ancestors are important. And I just wanted to honor that. Like, I think at the end of the day, I just want to honor that. And I felt like if I can do that, if I can honor the lives that they lived and the complexity and fullness that they lived in, with the strength and the forbearance of all that they lived through, then to me, like that's the goal. You know what I mean? Like, and if so, I'm humbled and happy to be of service in that mission.
Right, and you did a really great job. Yes. So we have a comment from Paula, who's someone who comes often. So hey again, Paula. Thanks for a great discussion. All I can say is wow, this is history I was not aware of. Thank you for writing this book and sharing this history with us. Yes, absolutely. And it's so important. It's important for us to know it anyway, and I think it's even amplified because we know that there are people who are trying to not tell our history.
Sure.
So books like yours, Tracey, are just so important to, add to the lexicon of things that are out there so that we can know and we can, see different things and hear different stories and not the same thing on, repeat all of the time.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll say, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I will say it, is that like, I know one of my pet peeves is when people do the whole, like, we are not our ancestors thing, right? That's this idea that our ancestors didn't resist. And I just want people to know that your ancestors resisted at every point, at every point, whether that was work slowdowns, whether that's gynecological resistance, whether that's running away, whether that's letting someone's throat, all the different ways that people could resist, they did resist. Right. And just because you've been sold one narrative that they didn't, or that there was a quote unquote, or the docile slave, that is a narrative and that is not true.
Right. So we have a few more comments. It's important to remember those who sacrifice. Absolutely. Let's see. Paige is excited to read this. Yes, it is an amazing piece of work. Cheryl, I'm with you. I love historical fiction. Look forward to reading this. And someone who's actually read it, Phyllis, love the book. Will there be a sequel?
I don't think so. But thank you, Phyllis, for saying that. I'll think about it.
Right. I guess, yeah. Because I mean, there is a space where I can see where it could be, but then, sometimes as writers, you want to, do something different. Oh, Phyllis says she actually wrote a review on Goodreads, so I think.
Oh, thank you, Phyllis.
That's good. I know the authors love that because that gets more eyes on the book and things like that. So that's important. Let's see what else. Kyle is saying, congratulations. I'm looking forward to reading the book. Thank you for the history lesson. Great discussion. Thank you for being here, Kyle.
Thank you, Kyle.
And let's see here. Are you going on tour? She wants a signed copy. My copy is not signed. I'm just showing it to you.
I will say there are signed copies in Atlanta at the Acapella bookstore.
Oh, okay. Well, Phyllis, I don't know if you're in Atlanta or not. I can go over there and see.
But Phyllis, tell us where you are. Currently, I would say there's no tour. I think I'm making appearances at particular book festivals and things as they come about. But right now, I would say, unfortunately, there's no real tour.
Right. Well, we're just glad to see you in this space. And I guess the advantage of these spaces is that you can be in your, like me, I'm in my office slash second bedroom, or, you can be in your office, or, wherever, if you're in a hotel, wherever you have to be, you can hop on a live as long as you got a good connection. So that's the good thing about this, and get to meet new people and talk to readers and, all of that. So I'm super excited for you. And I know that, well, I know it's right at 9, but 2 quick questions.
Oh, no, you're fine.
Is there's any advice that you would want to give to any aspiring writers? Because I heard you say it took you 10 years.
Oh, yeah.
So is there any advice that you have for aspiring writers?
I guess patience, I guess. I would say find community in what you're doing. I think being around other writers, I think is key. And I would say that's one of the things grad school was helpful for, where it's like, even though I was in a number of different communities writing, I think I wasn't around people who were publishing, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Because I think until you're around people who are doing it, then it just seems beyond you, versus when you're just talking to someone and just like, oh yeah, my book is coming out and this is how, and they can tell you about the process, and it doesn't feel like this mysterious thing behind the veil that you can never accomplish, or you can never get over that mountain. So I would just say, like, make inroads with other writers, go to writing conferences if you can make the time available, if you can make the time for it, like, do there's stuff like Tin House, or there's stuff like Sackett Street, there's like local writing stuff. I would definitely take a class. And I would say also be engaged in the rigor of your work. Like, your work deserves rigor. And I think take yourself past where you think you can go. Continue to work, continue to revise. And just be in conversation with other writers. Like, you'll be inspired by the writers.
All right. Community is important.
Community is so important. Yeah.
Very important. And last question. Are you working on anything else right now, or are you in the promotion mode? Because I know sometimes people are like, hey, that was a lot. I'm not even thinking about another book right now. Or, be like, oh, yes, I'm, 300 pages in, somewhere in between.
Yeah. I wish I was in the latter, but I'm probably in the former, where I'm just kind of like easing out of promotion mode and trying to kind of like get back to like having my normal kind of practice. So I would say right now I'm not anywhere close to close to like a draft of something yet.
Well, hey, and that's fair, because the reality of it is sometimes you got to slow down. I have to tell myself that sometimes, and I have not written my book yet, even though I was looking at my list of goals, and it says I'm supposed to put out a book in 2025 or 2026. So we shall see if that happens.
You're on track.
I got the good 2.5, 3 years to get it done. So, but yes, it is good to sometimes say, you know what, I need to stop. I need to take a break. I need to, as I think a lot of times, and this can be a book or anything, a lot of times we don't celebrate the success.
Oh, for sure.
We're so quick to move. Okay, did that. What's next?
Yeah.
And we don't take the time to celebrate the success of whatever it is that we've accomplished. So I'm glad you're taking the time to do that. So thanks again, Tracey.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I appreciate you for being here. And I do look forward to whenever the next one comes out. Or if you come to the A, let me know. So I'd love to connect. So I will let you go so you can enjoy the rest of your evening. And I'll just have a couple quick announcements for everybody else. If you want to hang out in the back, you can see what's coming up next. Or if not, we'll talk again real soon. So have a good one. And thank you again.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right. I'll see you soon, Marcy.
All right. All right, everybody. So I am super excited. That was a great conversation. I really did enjoy reading Night Wherever We Go. And I'm also excited about the next 2 books that are coming up. And believe me, I have more than that, but I usually only share 2 at a time just so it doesn't get too overwhelming. And both of these books have been out for a while, so some of you may have read them already. The first book for next week, we will be talking to Monica West about her book Revival Season. So that's next week. We will be talking to Monica West on the 6th. And so I'm looking forward to that. It's about a young girl in a church environment and some of the things that happened to her there. And then 2 weeks after that, let me make sure I made my thing. I might not have, so forgive me. But the week after that, we will have Kaya Alderson, and we're going to talk about her book, Sisters in Arms, which is about women, Black women who served during World War II. So for those of you who love the historical fiction as much as I do, this is going to be a good one. Okay, Phyllis, you're like me. You read all the books. So yes, so you please come back next week to get a chance for the conversation with Monica West. So that's coming up. And then, as I said, 2 weeks from today, we'll be talking about Sisters in Arms, Black women who served during World War II. So being that it's a continuation of Black history and women's history all rolled up into one. So I'm looking forward to that. So everyone, thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate you taking the time to come and, share in this conversation with us. And if it's your first time, please come back. If you know other book lovers, send them on over here. I am on, of course, Facebook as well as YouTube, and you can get a chance to catch up on some of the old interviews if you have missed some of the ones from before. Last quick note just for me is there is a Brown Girl Collective bookstore that is run through Bookshop. So if you're looking for any of the books of the authors that I have talked to or will be talking to moving forward, you can go and find some of those books there at the Brown Girl Collective bookstore on Bookshop. Oh yes, the author of Sisters in Arms is Kaya, K-A-I-A Alderson. So yes, she'll be up in a couple of weeks, and you'll just look for the banners and things like that on the social media, and you'll see the exact date and time, so you can remember to save those dates and times. So, and just by means of other things coming up, Connie Briscoe is coming. Let me see who else is coming. Sadiqa Johnson is coming. So yeah, we got some good people lined up over the next several weeks. Those are just two that I could see just by looking on my shelf. But we have a lot of great women that are coming up in the coming weeks. So thanks again. Stay locked in, and I look forward to seeing you again real soon, hopefully next week. Take care and have a good one. Bye-bye.